Lucky you.
36 best holes in
Into
golf.
Alternate Shots podcast,
Barney's Army.
where we talk about golf,
Sandy.
poker,
James Bond.
horse racing,
Double.
classic movies.
Zenyatta.
We have no script.
Down the stretch they come.
We are glad you joined us.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
So anyway, I started caddying for Jay in 1978. At some point in time, we were talking about the 74 US Open. And I said, it's funny. And I told him the story that I just told you guys about watching John Busick and then turning around from the 12th green and watching him play 16. And he says, well, I know you're not a liar. And I said, well, why is that? He said, because I played 72 holes and the only birdie I made was on 16 on Friday.
No way.
So if you'd have told me any other hole, I would have known that you were full of it. He said, I played 72 holes. The only shot, that's the only birdie I made. And I'll share an interesting story for the people that love the game. So Jay made the cut and he got paired with Johnny Miller the next day, who was a defending champ. I think he said he shot 78, which he said, by the way, wasn't that bad on that course, as you know, the massacre at Wingfoot. But I didn't play well. And he said, going back to my hotel, I realized that I learned two important things. First thing was that Johnny Miller didn't care about me. I cared about impressing Johnny Miller. He was a defending champ and all that stuff. And the second thing was more important, is that he wasn't supposed to care about me. I need to care about me. So we'll fast forward to the next year at Medina in 75. Jay's playing very good. I think he's within the top 15 going to the third round. And he gets paired with Nicklaus. So 1 year later, he gets to, and Jack shot 75 and Jay shot 72. And so very interesting how some people get it, whatever it is. But this kid at 19 years old figured this out. And 1 year later, beat Jack Nicklaus in the round that he played with him. And I think that's the interesting thing about good players is with all this information and TrackMan and forces and ground forces and obliques and, engaging the glutes and stuff. And we can measure all this stuff, but we couldn't measure how that kid figured out going down the Hutchison Parkway what he did wrong that day, right?
No.
So how did
But they say you can explain it to them, but you can't comprehend it for them.
Yeah, you can't really share experiences. And so I'm swing theoried out personally, but I'm so interested in the people that play and why they're good, because if the three of us 5 or 6 years ago went to Augusta and we sat in the bleachers on the range, we didn't know who anybody was. Okay. Now we've all been around golf our whole lives. We've seen it. And we had to figure out who the number one player in the world was. Not one of us would have said Jordan Spieth. Right. Not even close. In fact, he might not have been in the top 50, just watching his swing and everything. So, and as you alluded to, Scotty Scheffler. And so the kind of goes back to what Craig said about Dad. He thought he was one of them,
But do you think Craig Wood made an impression on him, because he was quite a golfer, obviously, and he thought so much of your dad? Do you think that kind of trend came down the pike and from your father to you guys? And
oh yeah, no, he always told us that Craig taught him how to swing, and he changed his swing, and Hogan taught him how to play. Because when they played at Seminole back in the 40s, when Hogan would go down there for the month before the Masters, they played a game where you threw $10 in the hat if you missed a fairway or missed a green. So when you play that game with Ben Hogan, you better be pretty good. Wow. And $10 is a lot of money back in the 40s. And so the year that Dad won the Masters, he said he actually beat Hogan more than Hogan beat him in that stretch. So when he got to Augusta, he had a certain sense of confidence that he always said Hogan made him feel like an amateur, not personally, just, how good he was. But he said that month before Augusta, he felt like he was pretty good. But, Dad had already got to the semifinals of the PGA in 45.
Yep.
and he got beat by Nelson in the middle of Nelson's 11 in a row. And so that seemed to be something that kind of just stuck with him, that I must be a reasonable player if I'm going toe to toe with Ben Hogan and occasionally beating him, you know. Well, in 48 is when he, that's probably the one in 48 where Dad beat Snead in 42 holes. And that story is interesting because in the morning, Dad shot 64 and was 6 up. Back to, can you imagine a club pro playing Tiger in the world match play and having him 6 down after, you know, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so, and then Dad birdied the 19th hole in the afternoon to go 7 up. And then Snead played the next 17 holes and 8 under. So now they're on the, have you guys heard this story?
No.
No, I haven't.
So Dad was because of Hogan, he learned to chart his way around the course. So the first hole had 2 fairway bunkers out there about 250. So in the qualifying and all the matches, he'd hit a 1-iron and a 9-iron on the green. So now Snead has, you know, made this incredible comeback. And Snead takes out a driver and he said he hits this thing. Not only would he carry the bunkers by 50 yards, but it was right down the middle. Just the most beautiful drive you ever saw. And I'm standing there with a 1-iron. You know, I'm like David and Goliath now. So I go back to my bag and I get my driver and I tee it up. And he says, I don't know what came over me, but I said to myself, you know what? I qualified 36 holes. I think that year he beat 3 major champions to get to Snead. You know, I made it this far with the great Sam Snead. I'm going to stick to my game plan. So he went back and put the driver back, got the 1-iron, 9-iron, 20 feet. And he said, Sam played the most beautiful pitch shot you ever saw, about 3 feet from the hole. And back then they played stymies. And by sheer luck, my dad missed his putt and it left Snead a stymie. He couldn't putt at the hole. So I said, what would you do in that instance? You know, just concede a half. He says, no, you got to make the great Sam Snead putt it out sideways and then give it to him. Just you got to embarrass him a little bit. So they got to the 42nd hole. This is another, he must have felt like he was one of them stories. So they both had about 25 footers. Snead was getting ready to putt, and my dad says, I don't think you're away. Now, how many guys would do that? Club pros, you know. And Snead says, well, why do I have to believe you? And he said, well, you don't. Let's get a referee. So a referee came out and got a rope and measured it. And Dad was away by 6 inches. And Dad made it, and Snead missed. And when he congratulated my dad, excuse my language, but he said, you hung my ass with that rope. Now, many years later, I was at Bob Golby's farmhouse in Belleville, Illinois. And I'd gotten in late at night. I was driving from Colonial to Muirfield to caddy for Jay. And he said, I'll leave the door open for you. Here's where your room is and stuff. And I go down and have breakfast, and Sam Snead's there. Snead's staying with Bob. So now I'm sitting there. My dad could embellish stories pretty good. So I always kind of took some of them. He was a great storyteller. So fact is, he did beat him in 42 holes. So there had to be some of it was true. So I wanted to figure out if I could get Snead's version of the story without going, hey, my dad beat you, you know, and PGA, you know. And so I said, you know, Mr. Snead, you know, my dad used to talk about the match he had with you at Norwood Hills. And, you know, he said how lucky he was, you know, he laid you the stymie. I kind of buttered him up a little bit, you know, and he immediately said he was the luckiest SOB. He told the exact story that Dad told. It was unbelievable. He said, your dad shot 63 or 4. He was 6 up. He went through the whole thing. And then he said he hung my ass with that rope on the 42nd hole. So the story was, and you know what? It still bothered Snead when he was telling me the story. He said he was the luckiest SOB in that match when he laid me that stymie. And you could tell, see, most players that are really good, they'll look back on stuff and they don't like it when they lose, you know, and that's why they're good, because it's not acceptable to them.
The story was so good it didn't need any mustard.
No,
Who needs to embellish a great story like that one?
You know, he's got the record. Have you guys played Fisher's Island?
Not.
I have never.
No.
Well, he's got 63 there, and they have a Pro-Am, and he shot it in the Pro-Am. And he told us it was a cold, rainy day, and the next score was 73, and the next score was 76, which has to be BS, because you don't beat, because back then all the best pros in the Mets section played in it, and they got a lot of good players. So I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, they got in touch with us. It was going to be the 50th anniversary of Dad's 63, and they wanted to know if we'd come play in the Pro-Am. And the appearance money wasn't enough for Butch, so he didn't make it. So it's a joke, by the way. And so Craig and I went. And I actually played with the lady that played with them, and Craig played with one of the guys. So they wanted us to speak at the dinner Sunday night. And the pro said, before I introduce the Harmon brothers, I want to recognize a great professional, passed away last winter, named Gene Borick, as you guys knew from the Mets section. And he was here last year, and he was talking to me in the pro shop, and he saw Claude's scorecard, and he said, I played that day. And so I'm listening to this, and he said it was a cold, windy, rainy day. I said, well, I got that part right of Dad's story. And he said, I love bad weather. I was a mutter. I always felt it was easier to shoot 72 or 3 on a bad day than to shoot 66 on a good day. So I played really good, and I shot 73. I said, this can't go here. He's telling this story. And I was 3 shots ahead of the next guy. The next guy on the board was 76. And Claude came in about 15 minutes later with a 63, and it was the greatest round of golf. I didn't witness it, but it was the greatest round of golf ever played on a course that I played the same day. Told the exact story that Dad told. So now I get up to speak, and I said, I owe my father an apology. I knew that story was BS every time I heard it. And he told it exactly the way Gene Borick told it. And I said, once again, Dad, little Billy was wrong and you were right, Just when you think about it, what an odd couple. Dad, 6 kids, pretty gregarious, club pro, I think my dad revered Hogan, but I think his quirks made my dad laugh, where they might have intimidated other people. Dad actually thought a lot of the stuff that Hogan did was so quirky, was just kind of humorous, and you probably have heard the story about the dinner the week of the Open in '59. I think Dad's sports psychologist was Johnny Dewars, and maybe Hogan's was Jack Daniels. And I was 8. We were all there. The boys were there and having dinner. And Hogan said to Dad, he said, you could play well this week, but you won't. And he said, how come? He said, well, you're a jolly golfer. And my dad said, what the hell's a jolly golfer? He said, well, you're going to get out of the car and you're going to see Mr. Williams there. When you get out, you're going to ask how his daughter's doing at Princeton and how his son's doing at wherever he's going to school. And Dad said, well, you're right. I had those people in my junior clinic. They're part of the fabric of the club and part of the fabric of my life. That's exactly what I'm going to do. He says, well, if they're your friends, they'll leave you alone. My dad said, well, he didn't really, what's he supposed to do? So he said to Hogan, what am I supposed to do? Kind of jokingly. He says, keep your eyes on the ground. Because if you don't make eye contact with someone in a big crowd, they don't feel bad that you didn't say hi to them because they could see you didn't see him, you see. So Dad decided to do that during the rounds. He didn't do it when he got out of the car and he was going to the range, but he thought, that might be a good thing to do when the tournament starts. So he could have seen some people. So he did do that. And as luck would have it, and life would have it, he got paired with Hogan the last round, and he beat Hogan by 6. So I said to Dad one time, I said, you ever needle Mr. Hogan about that jolly golfer BS? He said, Bill, if you're a golf pro, it would behoove you not to needle Ben Hogan about golf. I said, no, I did not needle him about it.
Keep looking at the ground.
Very happy to beat him.
Your dad that played with Hogan in the Masters and had a hole-in-one on number 12?
Yeah, that story's been told incorrectly forever. And I've never stopped people when they tell it, because I know the gist of it is Hogan's, fanatical concentration. But I was at my club about 4 years ago out here, wonderful club. And there was a guest at another table for some reason telling that story. And I didn't like the guy. He was a hot dog. And I said, you know what? I'm going to jack him up on this story. I'm tired of hearing the wrong story. I'm going to tell him the real story. And I said, you know, that's a great story, but it's not true. He said, well, I got it on, really great information. I said, do you really? I said, well, I got mine on pretty good information too. He goes, well, where'd you get yours from? I said, the guy that made the hole in one. How about that? So I'll tell you the real story. The real story is Dad did make one. It was a 47 Masters, and they'd been playing every day at Seminole in the practice round. Hogan hit it on the green. It's already been substantiated that he didn't make two. I've seen a leaderboard where it said he made three, which goes along with Dad's story. So Hogan never did say a word. Walking across the bridge, Dad picked the ball out of the hole way back to the crowd, whatever. And Hogan two putted, made a three. So he didn't make two and say it's the first time he ever made a hole in one. And walking to the 13th tee, in a barely audible voice, he said, nice shot, Claude. So now,
Wow.
my mom and Valerie were good friends, and they had dinner that night. So the two sports psychologists showed up, Johnny Dewars and Jack Daniels. And Dad was probably one of the few people that could needle Ben. And he needled Hogan. He said, Ben, I just made ace there on 12 today. You didn't give me much, And Hogan peered over the table and he says, you were lucky to get that because your hole in one didn't help me one damn bit. So the end of the story in the dinner actually is even more funny. So I finally told this story to people, the one that Dad told me. And I've never corrected people because it wouldn't be my, but I didn't like this guy. He acted like he knew everything. When somebody acts, some people will tell me stories about Dad that I just simply know are not true. I hear stories about me that aren't true. Unfortunately, some of them are true, which I'll own up to. But that one, this guy was such a hot dog that I said, you know what? I've had enough of this. I'm going to tell the real story. So that's the real story that he told me.
I love that story. But you talked about your dad shooting 63 in bad weather at Fisher's Island.
Mm-hmm.
Was he a good player too in those kind of tough conditions?
Yeah, because at Seminole, the wind blew. And Dad was one of those guys with the bowed left wrist, which kept the club face shut. He beat down on the ball. He hit the ball quite low. So, the 60 that he had at Seminole was 1947. That's never been beaten. And I don't know if I think the 61s at Wingfoot haven't been beaten.
Never been beaten.
So when you think of that, now I know the courses were longer and all that stuff now, but think of the equipment, the conditions, the greens. They were still hitting a lot of woods in the holes back then, even though they were shorter. So, my dad had the unique ability. He had one of his many theories on golf was that good players start the ball where they want to. And he could really start the ball where he wanted to. He didn't hit a lot of wild shots. I mean, he hit in the rough and this and that, but he never hit one of the, like a Mickelson shot. I never saw him hit a golf ball like that in my life, even on the range. One that was just off the planet.
Yeah.
I never really saw him hit what I would call a real wild shot. And he had such a love for the game. I never saw him get upset on a golf course, which bothered me because I was a club breaker and a club thrower. And about once a year, I still do it. And I did it the other day. I was playing with some members and I threw a club and I said, I'd like to apologize to you, but I'm not because it really felt good.
I was with a guy who threw a club one day and the caddy said to him, he threw it in the woods and the caddy said, I think you better throw a provisional. We may not find that one.
Yeah, I love stuff. And we were on 1 West and he had hit a drive and he had a 4-iron to the green and he hit the worst shot I think I've ever seen him hit. He hit a fat hook that just barely carried that bunker that's 50 yards short of the green. And he casually handed the club to the caddy like nothing happened. And I said, Dad, didn't that shot bother you? And he said, did you see it? I said, yeah. I said, did you think it was a bad shot? I said, yeah, it's the worst shot I've ever seen you hit. So he said, then I don't have to announce it then, do I? And I'll tell you who we were playing with. We were playing with Ray Mortel and Bobby Kuntz.
Yeah.
And he said to Ray, did you see the shot I hit? And Ray said, I did, Claude. Would you say it was a bad shot? Worst shot I've ever seen you hit. Said Bobby Kuntz. So he said, you see, Bill, why would I have to announce it? See, I don't want to be an announcer. I want to be a golfer. He said, now, by the time the ball landed, I'd already figured out the solution because I'm not going to hit another one today. By the time your ball would have landed with that shot, you'd have been 5 over after 4 because you'd carry it to the next 3 or 4 holes, you know. And of course, when he'd say those truthful things to me emotionally, I wanted to give him the bird, you know.
Yeah.
But that was a very interesting, that was sports psychology before sports psychology. Never saw him get mad on a golf course. Never in my life did I see my father show any anger on a golf course. Personally.
You ever see anybody then till now do it like that?
No.
On the tour?
No,
Anywhere?
because I really believe, well, the only guy maybe, but he was a wonderful guy, but he was in the Enchanted Forest, was Chip Beck. But
Spieth seems to get over it pretty quickly.
yes, I really believe that my dad truly did love golf. And I think later in life, it was one of his downfalls. He didn't have any hobbies. You know, and it's, you guys know, when my mother died, then his arthritis was such that he couldn't play golf. This is a rather personal analogy of what happened. So the 2 loves of his life were taken from him. And I truly believe after my mom died, if he could have played golf, his life would have been different because he would have been out there with you guys, you know, needling, and he would, those 4 or 5 hours would have been of great meaning to him. So they both left him at the same time but he didn't have a hobby. You know, it was golf and family. So those were the only 2 things he had.
Well, I had the pleasure of shagging balls for him when there were member guests. He would go in this bunker right here.
Yeah. Oh, unbelievable, wasn't it?
And maybe he did 12 balls in hole 2 or 3. Why was he so good in the bunkers?
You know, he just had a way of figuring things out. And if you remember, he had an uncanny rhythm, which you couldn't teach. You could almost see what he was doing. It was so smooth. You know, it's like you could, you know, Eliza ball's quick and fast. You couldn't really see it. Dad, you could kind of see it was like the lazy river, you know, and he just kind of flicked that thing out. I'll tell you a funny story about that. He's playing a practice round with Hogan and Middlecoff at Augusta. Middlecoff was a notorious bad bunker player. So they got 2 playing, and Middlecoff said to Dad, after lunch, will you watch me hit some bunker shots? My dad said, sure. So they took a few steps, and Hogan whispered to my dad, don't tell that dumb SOB anything. He may never find out. Well, once again, my dad laughs because he thinks this is funny. He goes, well, Ben, you know, I know that you don't teach, but when someone of Cary's ilk asked me for help, it's quite a compliment, really. So I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to help him, you know. So Hogan said, well, how did you become a great bunker player? And Dad said, well, it's funny you asked. When I was born, I don't know if you guys know this, my dad was deaf in one ear. I had an ear infection and they took out my eardrum when I was a kid. And back then, if you had a bad ear, you couldn't go in the water. I don't know if that's the same thing now. So when his mother and father would take his brother and his sister to the beach, he had learned to play golf caddying at 8 years old at a place called Dubstred in Orlando.
Yep.
He just fell in love with golf. He said, I'd take my sand wedge to the beach. So as everybody was swimming, I would just hit balls up and down the beach. And Hogan says, you just proved my point. You figured it out. Let that dumb SOB figure it out. He said, you just proved my point, Claude. Dad said, yeah, maybe he's got a, but he did give him the lesson. So, but he did have an uncanny, and it was different because he didn't cut across it. He swung straight. He didn't like the term open the face. He liked the term lay it back. He liked the hands behind the ball, not ahead. So everything he taught back then was different. They're all doing it now, I might add. Many of the great players today have a bowed left wrist, which they thought he was crazy about. And my brother Dick was almost as good as Dad, and he had the same kind of weird rhythm. It was, you could see it happening. I don't know how to explain it. You guys have played enough golf and you caddied and did it. When you saw a really good player, you knew what it was. Might not be able to say why it was great, but you can just tell. They used
Could
to say,
recognize it.
if a guy has a good grip and a good waggle, don't bet him too much, you know, on the first.
Yeah. Well, the other is that about the bad weather. I had an opportunity to talk to Billy Casper when we were going to ask him to be an honorary member, and he told us about the Open that the weather was bad.
He
Like,
said that it was the opposite wind because it was into the wind going out. And he said Hogan hit fairway woods into the first 4 holes. And he never hit one outside of 25 feet. And he played those 4 holes and 1 over.
wow.
He said he hit the 7 best shots you ever saw in your life. And was 1 over because the yips had taken over by then, I guess, or they were in full bloom. And so Dad finished 3-4-3 in 59.
Wow.
Think about that.
Wow.
But they were downwind, which makes a big difference, but still 3-4-3. I doubt anybody else finished 3-4-3. A lot of guys in 2006 wish they would have finished 3-4-3.
Right. Well, what you're
And they
saying
were kind
here-
of hitting the same clubs, by the way. They were hitting 6 and 7 iron. So I think that's the interesting thing about Wingfoot, because you can't make a course long anymore.
No.
So why are the last 4 holes so hard? When you think, or actually, I think starting on 13 is when it gets sporty. Because they're not hitting long shots into these holes. So my theory is that Wingfoot in a major championship set up for a US Open isn't a 15-round heavyweight fight, it's a 72 round. And so by that time they're worn out. You know, every hole they're grinding to make pars. And they're rope-a-doped. And by the time they get to 13 on Sunday, they're rope-a-doped out. You know, they just can't get to the house. Almost the history of every big tournament at Wingfoot, other than maybe the PGA, that
Davis one.
hard to get to the house, you know, because I think you're 4 days of just grinding. Now, you guys have played a lot, and I get asked this all the time, why is Wingfoot so hard? And I said, well, I got kind of a dumb answer, and you guys might agree or disagree. I said, I think it just has more hard holes on it. Another great course might have 9 hard holes. I think Wingfoot has 12 or 13. And so
Very
that's
few
another-
places that it lets up on you.
Never does really. And, you know, you'll look at number 7. Oh, that's an easy par 3. Yeah. You know how small that green is? It's easy compared to the holes that some of you've just played.
Right.
But if you threw that in the middle of another round, you're up there with a 6 iron or something. Well, I got to hit a dead solid shot, and I can't hit it more than 20 feet offline, basically.
Six looks like it's an easy par 4 with the pin tucked back on the right.
I always
Close.
thought the pin in the front was almost harder, because if you drove it in the rough, even for us as members, you're kind of shooting at an angle, and you don't, there's
Yep.
nothing, you push it 8 feet or you pull it 8 feet, you know, and you're making 5 or 6 again. So I always thought that was a subtly kind of a weird pin placement.
What
See, all those years you guys caddied, you learned golf course management. So,
I think getting and doing it are 2 different things, though.
yes. Yeah, because you have to.
Have to execute,
Your
yeah.
your ego is not your amigo in golf, you know.
Thanks for joining us
Casper.
today.
Billy
We
Harmon,
really appreciate your
Double
feedback,
Indemnity,
and please
Arky,
subscribe to the
Two
show
Outer,
and hit the
Claude
bell
Harmon,
icon so you get notified
Movie
of
Classics,
new episodes.
Mark Gable,
Hit them
Odd
hard
Job,
and hit them off.
Best 36 Holes.